Good evening to all our viewers around the globe. Welcome to today's presentation entitled Suppliers Necessary to Support Business, Survival, and Reinvention with our guest speaker, David Coffey. My name is Carolyn Jepson, and I head up the Marketing Communications Department for the World Trade Center Dublin and Webport Global. The World Trade Center Association fosters the development of international trade with a network of over 320 World Trade Centers in more than 90 countries worldwide. Webport Global is a cloud-based platform designed to help facilitate global trade by providing business connections, knowledge, and opportunities for all our members. Today's live presentation is brought to you by a collaboration between the World Trade Center Dublin, Boston, Washington, D.C., Barcelona, and Webport Global. I want to thank all of our international members, colleagues, and friends for tuning in today. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker and procurement expert, David Coffey. David is the founder and CEO of the Clearview Group. The first half of his career was spent in the US working in strategic leadership roles, both in banking and pharmaceuticals. In 2006, he went on to establish the Clearview Group, headquartered in Dublin, Ireland, and recognized as a leader in the field of procurement, providing leading edge managed services, sourcing, and transformation through quality and innovation. You can send your questions for David through the chat button, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation. Please note the session will be recorded. So without further ado, David, please take it away.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Carolyn, very much for the very kind introduction. I'm very honored to be here today meeting with all of you, and I do hope that at the end of this, I do manage to impart some benefit and insight to you. And I particularly appreciate everyone's attendance today, given sort of the challenges that we've got going on, and hopefully we'll keep this nice and succinct, and as I said, you'll get some value out of it. If I take a step back and look at some of my experience and through some of my career and organizations that I've worked with, there has been a perception from a purchasing or from a procurement perspective that the buyer-supplier relationship was very much a them and us relationship. And in practice and over the years, and I can give you some insight into what best practice organizations do when it comes to procurement, there's certainly a case for engagement. You as a buyer with the suppliers, be they critical or strategic type of suppliers. And certainly with the onset and sort of the long-term nature of COVID-19, it has shifted the sands somewhat here fairly significantly, where suppliers are now, certainly from my perspective and some of the clients I'm speaking with, very much part of the solution. There is an increased need for engagement to assist buyers through these challenging times. So it is a time, sort of a nexus for opportunity, depending upon your role. As a supplier, it's to really demonstrate the value that you can bring to the relationship as a valued partner. And it's an opportunity to reshape that relationship and possibly redefine it. And certainly as a buyer, be it the cost pressures or capacity issues or raw material issues that you're running into, to bring on more trusted capacity, another pillar within the business at a point of uncertainty. So it's a critical time. I might just move into the presentation, moving on to slide 5. And there's a little bit of a retrospective view here. If we go back to sort of 2019, start of 2020, let's not kid ourselves. Our world was riddled with uncertainty, and it was chaotic. Like I look at Ireland, we had Brexit, and it has gone into the background to a large degree. We didn't have a stable government, and certainly in the UK, we had the big election in the UK along with Brexit. If we then move this onto the global stage, we had sparring trading superpowers and the trade war that it's even more exacerbated right now. And we lived in a world of political upheaval. And setting aside all of that, we also had climate change. So there was a lot going on, a lot of volatility. But even with that volatility, there was a good degree of stability. When we think about our own sort of personal day-to-day lives, we could get up and we could bring our kids to school and know that they were going to be safe in school. We could go about our own work. We could attend conferences. We could go on personal or business travel. We could meet up as families, and we could attend sporting events. But COVID has brought something new and something different, a chaos, I suppose, that we haven't seen before. So we just move on to slide 6. Slide 6 is a little bit of a retrospective view, looking back maybe over the last 20, 25 years. As human beings, we're not immune to disaster. Something significant seems to happen every couple of years. To go back to 2003, 2011, 2 massive tsunami. The 2011 one in Japan, 25,000 people dead. $360 billion bill that they're still paying for. Global financial crisis, something that personally impacted me, bad timing for me moving back from the States to Ireland and setting up a business at the same time. And a lot of other people were affected. They were affected through losing their homes, losing their jobs. My son was 3 at the time. He'll be 57 by the time the Irish bill is paid off. So huge impact. But when we put those events in a context, the word event is particularly important here. COVID's different. COVID's different in scope. It's different in scope because of its geographic reach. We'll show you a map a little bit later on, which sort of shows the surge across the globe. So it's global reach. It's impacted every industry. It's not just localized to one industry. And it's been, I suppose, relentless across different social classes, ethnicities. No one is able to avoid it. So scope is huge. And there's a direct correlation as well with the global financial markets. So if something went wrong in Japan, there might be a bit of a blip somewhere and for a period of time. We'll see as we look at OECD numbers and we look at global GDP numbers, we'll see that there has been an impact, and it's a long-term impact. So the financial model is something really important. And an event, as we say, has a start and it has an end. And if we're looking at what's going on with COVID right now, we hear different timeframes for a vaccine. It may be 6, maybe 9 months out. Even if we get a vaccine, the manufacturing and distribution capacity has to be there to deliver this to 7-8 billion people. And all of our value chains, all of our products, they don't just get produced in Ireland or produced in the States and service the States. They're global products. So if we haven't cleaned this up globally, it's going to be a problem. And it's that connectedness which again, I think is a great opportunity for us, however, going forward. Moving on to slide 7. And we were hoping that we could have an interactive slide for you here. We actually did have one. We will send it out to you along with this. This is actually a very, very interesting sort of dynamic little model to look at. We were hoping we could just press play on this. But certainly from my time, I'm a great consumer of consumer affairs and world events. And as I was looking at things back at the end of December, start of January, we heard of this virus coming up, but from my perspective, it was just another virus. We'd had them in the early 2000s and they'd been quickly stamped out and they hadn't extended anywhere. To me, it started to get real. I've got family, I've got a sister living in Madrid and I've got a brother living in Italy. And when I saw it taking hold in those countries and those countries being very quickly sort of brought to their knees and their infrastructure and their whole economic model being disrupted, this is very real. Very quickly, decisions were made in Ireland and around the world to close down borders. And what was even more compelling was that the superpowers that we look to, the UK, the US, Germany, were all being impacted. So if we look at the dashboard of this, the dashboard right now has us over 15 million cases. It has us at over 600,000 deaths. The growth rate, again, it varies by country in terms of the strategy that they're adopting to it. In Ireland, they're talking somewhere about 1.2 to 1.8. So that's not good. It needs to be under the 1 as far as I understand. And as we say, the other dashboard number here is we still don't know when a vaccine is going to be delivered. So just crudely make the transition now to the sort of the commercial or business view. What does this mean? It means uncertainty. It's impacted how we've done things, and it's going to represent a complex challenge for businesses going forward. So we've looked at sort of the human impact, and let's now sort of delve in as we move into slide 8 in terms of looking at, say, the economic impact. So the ones that are usually first to take the pulse of this are private sector. Obviously, the decisions were made by governments very quickly, but the private sector will very quickly get a sense as to what's happening and start to make decisions. And there's various surveys that have been conducted by the likes of PwC and Deloitte. PwC, for example, surveyed 1,000 CFOs. So these are companies across the globe, across all different markets and all different industries, to take their pulse. And it was to get a view on whether or not they saw growth or contraction. And the response from that survey was a very compelling. Only 5% of those CFOs saw sales and profitability increasing. 95% saw some form of contraction. 57% saw at least a 10% contraction, and 25% saw a 25% contraction. So what does that mean in terms of the decision making? It means that they're going to be buying less, spending less. It means decisions then have to be made around organizational models and how businesses are going to continue. So it's got big implications. If we then look at it from a macro perspective, but from a short-term perspective, we look at the economies of the world. And what's really interesting here is we look at, say, the likes of the OECD numbers. The OECD numbers are pointing to countries that are extraordinarily developed, at the top of the curve, the likes of Germany, France, the UK, the US, and we're looking at double-digit contraction in terms of GDP. And if there's a second wave, going up to, say, 14%. If we look into next year, the 5-year growth plan will contract to the 5% growth plan will contract to 2%. So it's significant, but there's a double whammy for economies. So the economy's tax take is significantly reduced because GDP is down. And in addition to that, then they have the cost of supporting business, supporting unemployed, and the health sector, and all of those other supports to keep the economy going. And to keep all the social aids and everything that we need in place. I think it was just last week, the IMF reported they estimate sort of short to medium term bill for this is going to be $11 trillion. And Europe has just put together a €2 billion package. So this has big implications going forward. So we've looked at sort of the private sector view, big picture. We've looked at sort of the economic view, big picture. Let's now start to delve down and look at what countries are doing and what the response has been. And we look at this through sort of two axes, and we sort of plot it out looking at sort of 4 different quadrants. So we look at the health impact, whether or not it is a good or a bad health impact, and we look at an economic impact. Is it good or is it bad? And again, I think there's a direct correlation here between, and you can see sort of the variance in strategies that organizations or that countries have had in terms of the health element, trying to contain it, and the economic model, trying to balance all of those things. And that sort of led to sort of different strategies around all this. What I think is really most startling is we look at that bottom left-hand corner. It's here where we see the developed nations, the superpowers that we usually look to. But they're right now in the worst position. We'd be looking to them for the leadership role to help the developing nations through. So that presents a huge challenge. And remember, where does trade happen? A lot of the trade is happening in that bottom left-hand corner, and the buyers are in that corner as well. If we look at the bottom right, the bottom right-hand corner points to the likes of Australia and New Zealand. They're countries that seem to have a very good handle on this, although I know Australia is in that position right now whereby there seems to be a second surge. India, which I think probably the most populous or second most populous country in the world, an area that we go to for manufacturing right now, they've peaked at over 1 million cases. Sorry, they're at 1 million cases and they're about 2 months away from peak. Top right-hand corner is a very, very interesting situation whereby we've got China. China, very small number of cases. They were the first region to get this, and they've managed to contain it. They've had a quarter or 2 quarters of very slow growth, or of no growth, and then all of a sudden we're looking at 3.2% growth. And I would just show you sort of that curve up in the top right-hand corner. It's a real inflection point, that rapid growth. We look to see, are we going to see similarities in other geographies and in other industries? I would think not. But if we move forward, and now let's delve into and look at an actual country or an actual economy and how they dealt with it. Let's say, for example, this is Ireland. But Ireland, again, exists with multiples of these models around it. So what happened? We're a small open economy. we trade internationally. We import, we export, we manufacture, we deliver services across borders. Our value chains are cross-border. So the products that we use and that we consume come from other countries, and elements of them come from other countries. And when we witnessed what was happening in Italy and Spain in disbelief, one of the first things we did from a governmental standpoint was to shut down borders. As we started to shut down borders, again, that had a logistical impact. We looked at our supply chains, whereby, again, there were bottlenecks, more paperwork was required, more of a focus on medical and emergency, and the resource dedicated to that. That meant that companies weren't getting the product that they required. Now, as a manufacturer, you're not just getting the material, you're not just missing out on the products that you require and seeing delays. You're also seeing a very significant drop off in sales. So that then basically puts you in that area where cost is now becoming important. We're not trading as much. We've got very significant cost. We've got to make some decisions. Those decisions mean we're going to put people on furlough. It means we're not going to make the investment decisions that we thought about before. And from a consumer perspective, I now may not have a job, or I may be on furlough and my spending power isn't where it needs to be. So be it businesses and consumers were affected. And if you're on furlough, or you've got that less purchasing power, or you're a small business and you need supports, where are you going to go back to? You're going to go back to government for some of those supports. And that's what's been happening around the world. So this model has been emulated, but remember, we're all interconnected. We're all part of value chains that work together. So it's very, very important to understand those linkages, and the solution needs to be a global solution. Moving on to slide 11. Slide 11 gives us a very, very interesting insight into different industries. And I think when you initially look at this and you look at sort of the commonality of the curve lines they're following sort of the same pattern. So we have a number of different industries here in January, and we're looking at them from an index standpoint in terms of where they were back in the January timeframe versus where they are now and what happened in between. And I think if you're looking at those industries, they were quite stable, and actually you see some growth in some of those areas until we got to around mid-February. So we had about 6 weeks of sort of data coming up at that point. We had messaging coming out from governments, and people were saying, okay, it's time, we need to start making decisions here. And purchasing started to stop. So you started to see that contraction, you started to see the reverse. Big industries impacted. Energy was impacted quite significantly. It was in a bad position, I suppose, at the time anyway. And travel, and we'll talk about travel a little bit later on, but a 50% adjustment. You've got the likes of equipment. So investment decisions that you're making around new equipment, 35%. And also consumer staples down 20%. Not as much, but impacted nonetheless. Now the question is, as we get to sort of March timeframe, mid-March timeframe, and this was literally when schools were being closed down, you're seeing that it seems to have stopped, but it's sort of flattened out, and there's peaks and valleys. Not the same type of inflection that we're seeing in China, where it's been a really sort of rapid correction. So the general consensus as we look at those industries, they've been significantly hit. And this might cause structural changes, which we'll get into a little bit later on. Now, it hasn't affected some as much as it affected others, but we're not going to see that sort of V-shaped recovery. It's more of a trough, probably a little bit more longer term, and they might rebound at different times. Let's take a deeper look in slide 12 into a couple of the industries. I mentioned travel earlier on. For some industries, this has really actually been great for them. And I mean that just in terms of from an economic and from a commercial standpoint. They've seen huge upticks in their revenues. For other industries, it's causing massive pain, and we're already seeing structural changes take place. So I'm going to bring your attention to two of those industries. If we look to the top, small little black dot in the middle, it's the travel industry. And if we look at what's happened in the world of travel, business and commercial travel has stopped. And up until recently, we in Ireland could only go 2 kilometers or 5 kilometers outside of where our house was. So the idea of international travel and flying there on a jet was not going to happen. And what I would say with that is, if you look at the companies that are in those industries, the likes of Air France and Virgin Australia, Their cost models are such that they've got very significant headcount, and in addition to that, very significant cost in terms of ownership and operating a fleet. And when you're already indebted to the extent that Virgin was, 3 months of lost revenue is going to have a very, very significant impact, to the extent that Virgin was bought up by US private equity firm Bain over a matter of 3 months. You had a huge intervention in Air France in terms of billions of dollars from the French government. And on the other end of the spectrum, we look at the food retail. We had a lot of competition going on in the Irish market with the likes of Dunnes Stores and some of the other big providers battling it out with the likes of Aldi and Lidl. And in fact, what's happened right now, all boats are floating. Everyone seems to be doing better than other areas. And then we've got everything in between. And there is turmoil in industries, and they're dealing with it in different manners, to the fact that there could be some consolidation, there could be some restructuring, and it's certainly evident to say that there will need to be transformation in a lot of these industries. Cost is a big factor in all of this. If you don't have revenue coming in and you've got fixed cost, you need to reduce it and move to variable, or move as much to variable. The other thing is labor, and you want to make sure that you're not cutting off your nose to spite your face. You need to maybe shed some of that labor, but at the same time, then be able to switch that back on. So you're seeing flexible staffing models come into play. And I think I can also point to digitization. We are going to see, and I'm going to touch on this, an increased role for digitization. As companies and organizations start to look at cost, they think about how they're going to scale, they think about how they're going to compete. So there's some big factors coming into play, no doubt transformation. If we bring it down then to a personal level on slide 13, and I know some of the decisions I even made, I live in Wicklow, and I travel in and out to Dublin, or at least I did on a daily basis. I've no need for my car, I've no need for petrol, no need for oil, I've no need for the maintenance of that, my rail tickets, all of those types of things disappeared. Other things that I wasn't doing, wasn't necessarily going to the gym. I wasn't keeping up my dress or my attire or anything like that. I didn't even get a haircut. So you can start to look at some of those areas where there was a contraction, not just by me, but by thousands and millions across the globe. And then you look at the other side in terms of where there's growth. And those growth patterns came out in a number of different areas. It could have been doing up the home. It could have been building out your gym at home. It could have been self-development lessons that you were doing. All I'm pointing out here is that the patterns and the models that we had previously are in a good degree of disarray. There's been a lot of volatility around what we bought and what we're now buying. The question is, has that changed? Have we come back to a point of normalcy or stability? And I would argue, like, certainly as we look at COVID and the timeline for a vaccine, and I think of some of the transformative things that happened, I would say there is an element of permanency about what we have here, but a significant amount of change has definitely taken place. I'll also give you an insight into something simple, something very simple as a commodity. And to me, as I'm looking forward, I think we might see more of this coming down the pipe. The likes of, say, hotel salt, right? So my son does rowing. I dropped him off for rowing on Saturday and Sunday, and I got talking in this hotel to the general manager. As I'm waiting on my son, I'm talking to them about what does business look like? And he's saying, look, overnight stays are way down. And then I start talking to him about cost and supply chain. And I suppose this is where it got quite surprising. A 20-year supplier of salt, and every other source that he looked at was unable to supply salt. Couldn't get it, and no reason was provided. But they're seeing numerous of these types of situations pop up in their supply chain. And then when they did get it, no explanation, but a 20% hike. So visibility to capacity and to supply is going to be important. You don't want surprises. But the other thing then is a 20% hike. Now, should we be getting that from a 20-year relationship? Well, we don't know where that provider's at financially, which begs more questions, okay? So visibility to your supply chain, visibility to capacity issues, and where your suppliers are at is an important thing. But I think the relationship engagement there is key. We now take a step inside the executive suite as we move on to slide 14. And I've been party to some of these types of discussions over the years, and certainly of late. If you're thinking sort of January, February, the types of decisions that were being made in organizations, one of the areas, for example, is business continuity plans. I met with a financial services client last week. Their business continuity plan literally got thrown out the window. It meant nothing given the type of challenge that they were facing. It wasn't designed to address the scale and complexity of the challenge that they're facing right now. And when you, as a CFO or a CEO or a Chief Procurement Officer, you're looking around and you're seeing revenue contraction, what's the focus? The focus is cost and how do we continue to operate and deliver to our clients, okay? It's got to be cost. And there must be smartness around this. You don't want to eliminate your capacity to deliver your products and services. So you don't want to be tying up and eliminating all of your resource or getting rid of equipment or anything like that. Interestingly though, the investment decisions were looked at by the likes of PwC. And PwC were coming back and saying, across all the CFOs, the areas that were most in headlights were facilities. 83% of people said we were going to tackle facilities cost or investment. We weren't going to do it. Operations, 53%, and workforce, 49%. Interestingly, two areas that didn't get as much of a hit or probably seen as more strategic going forward will be the likes of R&D, 18%, and digital transformation, 16%. So these types of decisions are being made around cost and the continuity of the business. There's a direct relationship then back into supply chain. And the procurement and supply chain decisions there, yes, there's a direct correlation with cost. What you procure can be 50 to 80% of your overall costs. You've got to be able to address that. But in addition to that, we need to ensure that we have supply or we have alternative supply if we're seeing issues, or if we're running into issues around key inputs, that we've got an alternative, we've got enough stock, we can change the spec. So procurement very, very much took a center stage. So moving on to slide 15, and this is where my view would be the old models, the old way that we did things in terms of annual plans, business plans, hierarchies, all of those things that consultants would come in and advise on. We don't have time for them. We're going to have to really think about our business, our customers, and see how we can do it quicker, faster, more insightful without as much data. It's a degree of reinvention and reimagining. And again, there's several things that I'd ask you to focus on here. It is about revenue. It's about making sure that that revenue is protected, or that we reinvent the revenue. And it's about the things that enable that at the same time. And I'll touch on some of those. So revenue, the key thing there, is it disappearing? And if it is, we need to find a way to create new revenue or reinvent it. I'll give you some ideas on this a little bit later on. In terms of structure and skills, if I'm 4 or 5 levels removed from the CFO or the CEO and I need decisions to be made, those layers will mean slow decisions. Those slow decisions will mean we may not be around in a short period of time. We need devolved decision making. And from an operational perspective, the processes within and outside of the organization, even with your suppliers, they need to be tight, they need to be high performing, they need to give you as much flexibility as possible. The other thing that I would say is your value chain. You don't operate as an island. You operate in a production chain or a service chain whereby you're dependent upon inputs and there's someone dependent upon your outputs as inputs. We need to be cooperating with all elements of that chain, up and down the stream, because they're only as strong as you are, and vice versa. It's the weakest link sort of analogy, and we have to have those types of open dialogues. The other piece in this is digital, and we have to be looking at digital within our business, from an efficiency standpoint, from a scale standpoint, from a data insight perspective as well. And these are the things that are going to allow you to compete. So we built a little model here on the right-hand side, which sort of demonstrates it. The Fitbit type model that you see there, really impressed here with a Chinese company, January, February timeframe, seeing a collapse in their business, collapse in their revenue. And they quickly realized that, well, maybe that isn't the business for us. When they started looking at the user health data that was coming back, they were getting insights into like sleep arrhythmia and cardiac issues across their customers, and saying, look, we're sitting on a different product here, which is actually much more valuable. Should we not just move into that? Very interestingly, moving to the next one, there was a US company planning a launch of a street side delivery curb service, like a FedEx type thing. They had an 18-month launch time frame. COVID hit, and within 2 days they had it launched. It means we fundamentally, we're conservative. We plan things out too long. We can actually do things quicker and faster than we think. The other area here is about sort of supply chain, sort of getting into sort of my area of things, whereby companies, and an array of different examples where they realized we didn't have extra capacity and we had underperforming suppliers. We need to really buttress this up and put the right supports and models in place where we've got extra capacity, where we've got vendor managed inventory, whatever that might be, and putting solutions in place. And then the very last one on the right-hand side, and this talks about that cooperation, whereby Johnson & Johnson and Prisma coming together. Prisma, we've a lot of ideas around products, and we've got a lot of ideas around innovation in health products at a time when we need ventilators, and they're coming together with Johnson & Johnson, who has massive brand, massive power, the ability to sell and to market. Final one there going across all of this is digital. And I think we all need to increasingly look at digital, and there's a huge swing to the likes of SaaS models. But if you're operating an airport right now, huge fixed cost, no revenue coming through. You want to be able to entice people back, and you also want it to be a safe but efficient and lower cost experience. So digitization or digital needs to be part of that, from the point of arriving at the airport and dealing with your bags, through security, through check-in, contactless experience. So these are elements that I'd like you to think about. And they all do have sort of a procurement or a specification element to them. Moving on to slide 16, and this to me is a really, really important slide. If you think about how we've made sort of decisions around our supply chains over the years, and I would say certainly with clients we've worked with and a lot of organizations, they're very, very strategic around how they make decisions. They're very fact-based, they're very structured decisions. They're looking at things like quality, service, innovation, risk, and price. And they're all criteria around where they make their decisions. But increasingly, I've seen a shift to, let's say, outsourcing or to low-cost country type models, be that the likes of China and India. So in that equation of cost versus quality versus risk, where is risk? And if we're looking at the position that we're in right now, I'd ask the question, if there was so much movement to China, was that a flawed decision? And I will pick both sides of the coin here. No, it wasn't flawed, because if you didn't move and do that and move to those types of markets, low cost country markets, someone else is going to do it and they're going to capture market. At the other time, yes, it was, because you had insufficient backup and resilience. So what's going to happen? Are we going to move from a low cost supply chain type model to one where we've got duplication? There's a lot of cost, a lot of talk about that at the moment, where we're going to bring everything home, duplicate supply chains and have it all local. I think it's going to be somewhere in between, whereby we can't swing the pendulum too far around risk management, but we've been taught a harsh lesson. So let's get an insight now into how procurement operates. So we move on to slide 17, and let's get a glimpse inside what a CPO. What's a CPO? Yes, there are actually organizations out there that have a Chief Procurement Officer. They sit on the board. And if you think about it, the responsibility isn't just around the purchase order or the selection of the supplier. It's around value. It's around building competitiveness within the business and continuity, making sure we've got a supply chain that ensures continuity and competitiveness. So the solutions are being built for the future, and they include quality, they include innovation, risk, and cost. That's what the value is. And if you're managing that, you're managing your future. And best practice models, and I've reported into CFOs and CEOs myself, both in ABN AMRO and in Takeda Pharmaceuticals, and I've seen the model with a number of our clients. I'll point you to the left-hand side of that screen, that little sort of hexagonal model. You need to have a procurement strategy that's aligned with where your business is going. So if we've 4 or 5 years down the road, we're moving into new markets, we're launching new products, we're divesting certain things or pulling out of things, your model needs to support that. And it means that the big things we buy, the categories of be it facilities or IT or marketing, we need to have plans around what the procurement for that is going to look like. And we need to have an organization that can support that. both within procurement and outside procurement, with the skills and the appropriate structure. We also need to make sure we've got the right processes from the point of thinking about what we're going to procure and planning, all the way through to selecting and then managing it for the next 10 years and making sure we've got the right systems. Equally, it means we got to make sure that we're managing our top suppliers, and in fact, the inverse of that, managing suppliers, managing supply, to make sure we're managing most of our value and most of our risk. And this should be an integrated approach. If we're doing this properly, we're moving up that curve on the right-hand side and giving more value back to the business. So moving on to slide 18, and I think this is a particularly pertinent one. And we, Clearview, we've actually ourselves, we've developed our own cloud-based technology called Seer, and it's about getting insight into your supply chain. And I would ask the question, how many organizations truly have insight into their supply chain? Many organizations, in fact, that we've been dealing with, they've been struggling with this, and to a degree they're flying blind. They actually think in terms of risk, from a probability and from an impact perspective, they're somewhere down in that sort of heat map in the green area, when in fact they're not. There could be issues with their suppliers, their financial viability. There could be issues in the market. There could be a big regulatory thing coming down, or the suppliers could be underperforming, or it could be all of those things. And in fact, they're not in the green, they're in the red. So your sophisticated procurement functions are all about getting visibility to their markets and to their suppliers to see if there are opportunities or if there are risks. And they're getting to the point where they want to be able to even predict that risk and anticipate it before it happens. So you've got to figure out who or what is important. You as a seller, is what you're providing important to the buyer? And because they will be asking the question themselves. Is there a sourcing plan that looks multiple years ahead? And is that based on one supplier or multiple suppliers? Is it based upon a new or different product? Is there a contract in place, and is the contract based upon service provision and service level agreements? Is it one that addresses and anticipates risk? That if something did happen, do we have a backup for it? And is it one whereby we're tracking financials? So this is where they're going. So if we move on to slide 19, it's a little bit of a chart here, right, with lots of different things going on, but this is essentially how they work. They are data driven. Procurement is not now about processing purchase orders and POs and managing tenders. These guys are about managing risk and value for the business. And they've become far more strategic. And if you look at that process flow on the bottom left-hand corner, really what that points out is that procurement now is a multi-year cycle. They manage things on the basis of big categories of things that they buy. And the tender or the RFP is the middle of the process. There's a lot of work and analysis that happens before that. They've got a plan. So they have to engage with the business. They have to have a multi-year plan around what we've bought and what we will buy. And is that now fit for purpose? They want to look at what happened with performance of suppliers and what do we need going forward. They want to know where pricing was and where it's going to be. They've also got to look at the market. What's the size of the market? Is it contracting? Is it growing? What are the segments in the market? What's the right segment for us? Who are the players? What are the new products? What are the innovations that are coming through? And also we've got to look at specification. If we're going out now and we're buying servers, well, is that not the wrong model? Should we not be looking at buying cloud? So the spec, the market, the suppliers, they change. And again, as we look at the planning piece, equally there's a significant emphasis on the back end, where they want to be able to track your spend. They want to be able to manage the contract. They want to be able to manage your performance against KPIs and correct that or improve it. And they want to be able to manage risk. So very much data driven, very strategic, and it's about keeping their operation moving forward. And a lot of organizations have managed to weather this. So if we move on to slide 20, and this is, for me, I want you to think about some of the points that we brought up earlier on, where we were talking about reinventing the business, but also thinking about how procurement operates now from a more strategic standpoint. Bring those design elements and the understanding of that procurement structure together. There's an interdependency. The suppliers need the buyers and the buyers need the suppliers. There will be cases, quite honestly, the way that they think, there are certain things that are critical and strategic to them. There may be certain things, it might be office supplies, that are less important. So they are going to make that prioritization themselves as to the categories and the suppliers. But sometimes you've got to be upfront and center in that. And certainly, if I'm sitting in that hotel and I'm the GM of that hotel, and that supplier is coming back to me after 20 years of a relationship, I'm looking for a lot more value than that. So what can you do? And we've sort of broken it into sort of 3 different pillars here about engagement, improving your resilience, which I think allows you to have better engagement, and ultimately then repositioning yourself. Okay, so the first thing is, and I'd almost point you to the little graphic that we have, the colorful graphic up in the top right hand corner. Think about what you're buying and determine, is it of value and importance to your client versus the other types of things that they buy. It's a quick exercise that you can do. So prioritize sort of your customers and the relevance and importance of what you're providing them. The other thing is speed. Don't be sitting on your hands. It's a new world right now. You've got to talk to these guys. But if you're going to do it, it's not just a one-time affair, it's dialogue. You need to be sitting down and talking with them on an ongoing basis. If I'm CPO or if I'm a procurement guy, it's great to know that my suppliers are now coming in and talking to me. Don't be afraid to have those conversations, but come in with facts, okay? So this is where I talk about the improving resilience. I want to know as a buyer that your business is sound, right? So you need to do those checks yourselves. Are your revenue numbers where they're at? Is your cash flow strong? Do you have sources of funding coming in? What's Dun & Bradstreet saying about your business? Are they saying that you're viable? I also want to know that you've got capacity. Do you have inventory? Do you have enough people to be able to produce? Can you deliver? Are there any blockages there? Do you need to find other sources of supply and start to engage with that supply market? And all of this is about giving value back to your client, saying, we've got a handle on these things. We've got these things sorted. We have our solutions in place. It's also good to be able to, as I talked about, the value chain partnerships. If you're a logistics company and you've got a warehousing company and you can put together a solution for your client, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that type of creativity where you can actually come in and help us. The other things might be around demand and specification. This is probably one of the first things you should ask. Is your demand and forecast at the same level that it was before COVID? Because there's no point in you going out and buying a whole load of stuff if you don't need to. But equally, if you can provide something else and it's cheaper and demand is there, or you can change your spec, and think about the companies that have altered their spec or they've used the process that they have. A number of drinks companies very quickly moving into the hand sanitization business. I've seen that across the globe in terms of companies that have done that. So can you come up with a solution that's going to work for your customer? The other thing then is that you've got insights. You've got insights as to who's in the supply chain, where's their capacity. And I would say at times, don't be afraid to sort of introduce a competitor, because if you don't introduce the competitor, you may not have a customer. The other thing that I would say is digitization. And are there areas quickly that you can start to digitize within your business? Now, again, part of that's around funding. If you're bringing that into the relationship, into the dialogue, it then allows you to put yourself in a different frame of mind and a different viewpoint with your client. And what I would say on that as well, they might reprioritize you. There are probably a couple of things here as well that you could think about. Number one, are the things we can do from a payment terms perspective. We ourselves have actually gone to some clients and said, look, we're going to give you a little bit of flexibility. Some have come to us and said, can we push our payment terms out a little bit longer? We're going to move you from this day to this day. And that can be vice versa. The other thing would be, if you're going in with this type of value and this type of stability, they could well say, well, look, can we actually extend our contract with you? Can we move it from 2 years to 4 years to ensure that we've got supply? And that then also allows you to reposition not just the commercials, but also the legal elements of the relationship. So there's a lot of value that you as a supplier can bring to it, and realize that that value is being recognized by the provider. So on my end, that's it from me now. I would certainly be open to and welcome to hearing some questions if there are any. And thank you for your time.
Great, David. Thank you so much for sharing such important and relevant information in this truly uncertain time. We do now have time for a couple questions. For those that David can't get to today, we will follow up via email. So the first question we received is, what are your thoughts on dealing with suppliers in a public procurement area where there is an absence of a contract?
Okay, so I've quite a bit of experience in public procurement, and what I would say is when you don't have a contract in public procurement, it is a different animal. You are subject to audit, and you've got to remember that ultimately what you're spending there is taxpayer money. You need to be able to, be it with the controller and auditor general in Ireland or other auditors internationally, demonstrate compliance. So you've used, based upon the amount of money that you're spending, that will dictate whether or not it's a national or, let's say, European level procurement. It will also influence the type of procedure that you've chosen to go out to market. So you certainly do need to be able to say that you've got a contract in place. I would certainly say as well, you need to, if someone's providing a service to you as a buyer, you need the appropriate commercial protections from a price standpoint, from a service standpoint, from a warranty perspective, and also the legals. What happens if they fail? So I would be saying, have a plan in place to procure that service maybe properly, try and put some protections in place in the meantime with that provider, but then go out to market and ensure that you're putting a contract in place. Other companies and geographies as well, if this is public money, should have the ability to compete for and win that business. And certainly as an SME, if I see that someone's providing that service but it didn't go through a proper process, I'm feeling restricted and I might challenge that. Okay. Hopefully I've answered the question.
Yeah, that's great. Kind of second part of that, with strategic suppliers, on the other hand, should we be contacting them, asking how things are going, possibly offering more favorable payment terms?
I would say absolutely. You need to have that prioritization session fairly early on as a buyer, where you're sitting down and you're looking at who are our top suppliers. Now, I don't just mean on the basis of spend. You've got to look at it in terms of dependency, criticality. If, for example, that supplier shuts down or is disrupted, what impact does that have to you? So, and it doesn't just have to be small spend suppliers. So yes, they should be contacted, and it should form part of how you manage your suppliers. The thing is, suppliers can't self-manage. So if we put a contract in place back 4 or 5 years ago, we can't just let them forget that and walk away. You have 4 or 5 years of spend, 4 or 5 years of performance or underperformance. So what I would be saying is, the things you need to be doing is prioritizing those suppliers and probably doing financial due diligence, because the finance you saw 4 years ago probably still doesn't stack up. And you should be tracking their service. And when you go to market, you should be building in a service level agreement with key performance indicators to track how they're doing. If there are issues with the provider, hopefully they can be resolved. But where there is redundancy, or where there is redundancy, I should say, that would mean you're going to have to find another supplier. You're going to have backup stock. You may in fact have to take on that thing internally if it does begin to fail. But that's all part of how you plan for these procurements. But yes, you should be engaging with them.
Great information. The next question is, can you give an example of how the Clearview Group has helped one of your customers reevaluate their business model to achieve success during this pandemic?
Okay, so probably a couple of examples in terms of business model. One sort of quick example, we've actually had quite a few organizations come to us, both public and private sector, is more around sort of building procurement capability. So we've actually been delivering, say, training programs to them to say, look, we've only got 1 or 2 resources in this area. We all need to be managing our suppliers. We need to be procuring properly right now. So we've actually been engaged to assist them to build up capability at executive level and across management level around how they plan for, do procurement and manage their suppliers. We've been engaged by a couple of organizations in healthcare and in global food, really again looking at their top suppliers and saying, look, we have exposure here, but we don't know where that exposure is. Can you do a proper review to help us define who our top suppliers are, and then start to do a root and branch analysis, looking at what we're spending with them, where the risk is, and what type of exposure we might have. We were actually brought in by a food/pharma company who were I suppose, completely looking at their business, their offerings and their markets. And we help them go through a sort of a prioritization exercise, if you will. They found that certain products were very costly, not getting much revenue, a drain on the business. So they're almost looking at their product mix and saying which ones are best. And then it's about trying to put the supply chain in place for them fairly quickly. So there's been a few different interventions, I suppose, that we've had with organizations.
That's great. Now, you briefly touched on your system, Sears. Can you describe what it does?
Okay. Our system, SEER, and I suppose I've worked with a lot of different systems from a procurement standpoint there. It's really about seeing the risk and de-risking. We did a survey back in the tail end of 2020. And from our survey, like if you think of organizations now, they spend a huge amount of money, 50 to 80% of their cost is tied up with their suppliers. And really your suppliers are an extension of your business. We had 81% of the respondents coming back dissatisfied with the systems they had to manage their suppliers. And I think it was 78% were using spreadsheets. So if that's your approach to managing your spend and managing your risk, that's going to present some challenges for you. And typically what we saw there was sort of no integrated system to manage supplier information, to manage the contracts, to manage the performance in those contracts, and to manage risk. And that's essentially what we're doing. We put together a SaaS solution that we give to buyers. We profile the organization and we push it out to the suppliers and we say, okay, you're going to be part of the solution and you're going to get opportunity here to maintain your profile. We'll have your contracts loaded up. We will work with you on your performance. And we will track things like risk and pull in market intelligence. So we're now getting a total view of suppliers. Hopefully it's a current view, hopefully even more so, it could be something predictive. So the other thing is the flip side of that is for the suppliers, not only do we have visibility to them, but it gives suppliers visibility to their own relationships, to their contracts and a pipeline of opportunity. And even within that, they can then start to exist within a universe of other buyers. So there's a good opportunity there whereby they can start to get in front of other companies and sell their products. Hopefully I've answered it.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we're closing down on our time limit here. So what I'd like to do is just let people know that you'll be following up, as I mentioned, and also just to thank you so much again for sharing your expertise with our global audience. If you want to connect with David and find out more about the Clearview Group, you can help and how it can help you position your company to succeed in a new business paradigm. Please contact him at david.coffey@clearviewgroup.ie. Also, I just want to announce our next webinar on next Wednesday, July 29th, entitled Marketing, Selling, and Servicing Your Customers on Uncertain Times with Diana Zalquet from HubSpot. Again, thank you, David. Thank you to all our viewers. Stay safe and well.